There are over 5,000 living, breathing, biological organisms just like sitting in your kitchen right now.
Yeah, which is kind of wild to think about.
Right. And there's a very good chance you're just going to sprinkle them on a stir fry tonight and, not give them a second thought.
It really puts a completely different spin on meal prep when you look at it that way. I mean,
Right.
we treat the spice cabinet like it's just this collection of colored dust.
Yeah, totally.
We completely ignore what those little jars actually contain.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are looking at the notes from a really brilliant, highly unconventional gardening experiment.
And it's one that attempts to completely bypass the traditional gardening industry.
Exactly. The premise is super simple. Taking standard jars of cooking spices directly from the grocery store aisle and just planting them.
Which sounds a bit crazy at first.
It does. Now, if you are listening to this and, glancing at that 5-year-old jar of cumin in your pantry, you're probably thinking there is zero chance that dust is going to sprout.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair.
Okay, let's unpack this because it feels like a massive stretch to treat the spice aisle as this dormant botanical garden, right?
It's a completely fair assumption. For anyone who has ever, tried to start a garden, there's this very specific, almost intimidating ritual we're all taught to follow.
Oh, the garden center trip.
Right. You go to a specialized center, you buy those delicate little paper packets.
The ones with the beautiful watercolor vegetables on the front.
Yes. And you treat them like absolute gold.
Right, because you get what? Maybe 20 seeds in a packet for $4.
Exactly. It's a precious, high-stakes endeavor.
You plant them with tweezers.
Yeah.
You obsess over the soil drainage, and you just sort of pray the elements don't destroy your very limited investment.
Yeah, the pressure is real.
So the idea of skipping all that and just pouring a $2 plastic shaker of, grocery store seeds into the dirt sounds a bit ridiculous.
It really does.
I mean, let's be realistic here. These are shelf-stable food products. They sit under harsh fluorescent lights. Wait, these jars are meant for cooking, sitting on shelves for who knows how long. Why should we logically expect them to grow at all?
Well, we shouldn't expect all of them to grow, and the experiment notes make that very clear.
Okay.
A lot of those jars are just filled with biological duds. To understand why, you kind of have to look at the mechanism of how a spice gets from a field to, aisle 4 of your supermarket.
Which involves a lot of processing, I imagine.
A ton. Many of these seeds are subjected to intense heat. They are steam sterilized, they're baked, or even irradiated just to kill off pathogens and extend their shelf life.
Wow, so the embryo inside the seed is literally cooked to death.
Exactly. The processing completely destroys the biological viability of the seed. You're left with just the aromatic oils and the flavor profile.
That makes sense.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the underlying philosophy of this experiment isn't about expecting every single jar to turn into a lush forest. It is about redefining where we source our potential gardens. By viewing those spices as potential highly accessible seeds, we basically bypass specialized vendors entirely.
So it opens up a world of really cheap experimentation.
Exactly. If a jar costs a couple of bucks and nothing sprouts because they were roasted, well, you haven't lost an expensive curated investment.
You just go back to using the rest of the jar in your soup.
Right.
But the experiment doesn't really dwell on the failures, because there is this massive glaring outlier.
A huge
One specific spice that apparently defies all the processing odds, and that is sesame. Sesamum indicum.
Yes. The sesame seed.
According to the trials, out of all the spices tested, standard grocery store sesame has a shockingly high germination rate. How is that even possible?
It's surprising, right?
Yeah. I mean, if most spices are cooked to death, what is the mechanism allowing a basic jar of sesame seeds to survive and actually sprout?
So it really comes down to how different seeds are processed for culinary use. Unlike spices that require heavy roasting or, heat treatment to unlock their flavors.
Like cumin or coriander.
Right. Raw sesame seeds are often simply air-dried. And that's just to preserve their natural, really delicate oils.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So this lack of extreme heat inadvertently puts the seed into this perfect state of suspended animation.
That's fascinating.
And furthermore, sesame seeds have a remarkably high oil content. That oil acts as a dense protective barrier for the plant embryo inside.
Kind of like a shield.
Exactly. It seals in the necessary moisture and protects the genetic material from completely drying out, even when it's just sitting on a supermarket shelf for months.
So they are effectively wearing microscopic armor. They're just sitting there waiting for a signal to wake up.
Yep, just add water.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. When we consider the volume we are talking about, the implications for a home gardener are huge. Because think about a typical jar of sesame seeds, like a bagel topping. We are talking about thousands of individual seeds in one small container.
Easily thousands.
Yeah. When you go from 20 expensive seeds in a fancy catalog packet to 3,000 cheap ones in a spice jar, with thousands of seeds in a single cheap jar, doesn't that completely remove the fear of failure that usually comes with gardening?
It does. It entirely democratizes the process.
Right.
When you have thousands of viable seeds at your disposal for mere pennies, that whole fear of failure just evaporates. Gardening shifts from being this careful, highly controlled activity into a joyful act of massive experimentation.
You just don't have to be so precious about it.
Exactly. You don't have to worry if a bird eats a dozen sprouts. You don't have to panic if one patch of soil doesn't drain well and some seeds rot. I mean, you have sheer numbers on your side.
You can just toss them everywhere. Try them in the shade, the sun, in pots, in the ground.
Yeah, you stop being a nervous caretaker and you basically become an explorer.
But let's say you do this. You scatter a handful of sesame seeds across your garden bed, and against all odds, they sprout. This actually brings up a really practical problem noted in the experiment.
Oh, the identification issue.
Yeah. It's one thing to see a tiny green shoot come up out of the dirt. It is another to know what you are actually looking at.
Right, because if you plant a labeled seed packet, you know exactly what to expect.
Exactly. But if you plant a spice, how do you know you haven't just watered a very enthusiastic weed?
That is the exact moment of doubt every gardener faces when they plant outside the traditional constraints. You're completely divorced from the visual expectation.
So in the notes, the author of the experiment actually had to employ some modern detective work to verify the identity of the sprouts.
They did, yeah. Specifically, using an AI-powered botany app.
Let's talk about that because, AI gets thrown around a lot as a magic word lately. How does an app actually verify that a tiny green sprout is definitively sesame and not like dandelion fluff that blew into the yard?
Well, it's all about analyzing topography and vascular structure.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
So these applications don't just look at the general shape of a leaf. They map the intricate vein patterns, the serration on the edges, and the exact way the leaves emerge from the stem.
Oh, so it's super detailed.
Extremely. By cross-referencing those microscopic visual data points against a huge global database of known plant morphology, the tool can definitively pinpoint the species, even in its really early stages.
That's wild. And the specific physical characteristics that the tool picked up on for the sesame plant are incredibly vivid in the source material.
They really are.
The notes describe the verified sesame leaves as broad, flat, and solid, but with this hairy quilted texture.
Yeah, hairy and quilted.
And they grow in pairs on stems that are soft but thick. I kind of want to focus on that hairy and quilted description.
It's a great image.
Visually, I picture a cozy stitch blanket, right? Which is a stark contrast to the smooth, glossy leaves we typically expect on a garden vegetable. Is this highly specific texture what makes it so verifiable? Like, nature doesn't do things just for aesthetic appeal. What is the functional evolutionary purpose of a hairy, quilted leaf?
What's fascinating here is that the botany gets really complex. The quilted texture, those deep grooves and raised sections on the leaf surface, it creates microclimates.
Microclimates on a single leaf.
Yeah. It actually increases the overall surface area of the leaf without making the leaf itself wider.
Oh, that's clever.
Right. This allows the plant to capture more sunlight from various angles as the sun moves across the sky.
So it is essentially a highly efficient solar panel with built-in texture to maximize energy absorption.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the hairs then?
The hairs, which are scientifically known as trichomes, they serve a dual purpose. First, they act as microscopic radiators.
Radiators?
Yeah, in the intense heat of the environments where sesame naturally thrives, those hairs help dissipate heat. They trap a tiny boundary layer of still air right against the leaf surface. This actually slows down the evaporation of water, which is what allows the plant to survive in really arid conditions.
That is brilliant.
And second, they act as a physical barrier. To a microscopic pest looking for a meal, a dense forest of tiny hairs is incredibly difficult to navigate. It literally keeps the plant safe from predation.
That completely changes how you look at the plant. I mean, it isn't just a weird texture. It is a complex survival mechanism.
It really is.
And noticing those intense sensory details is kind of the ultimate payoff of this entire experiment. You shake a tiny, smooth, hard white speck out of a spice jar, and out comes this broad, thick-stemmed, heavily armored organism.
Yeah, it proves that this totally mundane kitchen item has successfully transformed into a complex, recognizable organism.
It's almost like magic.
It really demands that you pay attention to the biology of your food. You aren't just consuming it anymore, you are observing its biological imperative.
Right.
And, the stems being described as soft but thick is another really great functional detail.
How so?
Well, it tells you that this is not a woody, brittle herb that takes years to establish. It's a substantial, fleshy, fast-growing plant that is throwing all of its energy into rapid vertical growth.
Why is it in such a rush, though?
Because its entire life cycle is built around getting tall enough to produce seed pods before the dry season hits.
Ah, okay.
That thick stem acts as a water reservoir and a sturdy structural column to support the weight of the heavy pods it eventually plans to produce.
Which perfectly bridges to the conclusion of the experiment. Because the narrative builds to this really fantastic realization. Sesame has officially earned a spot as a regular in this garden.
It's not just a novelty anymore.
Exactly. It isn't just a party trick. It has become a staple. To explain why, the notes draw a really compelling contrast between the newly established sesame and a traditional garden regular, basil.
I love this part. That pairing is brilliant because it perfectly illustrates the two fundamental ways a plant allocates its metabolic energy.
So what does this all mean? The functional difference is striking. I mean, basil is grown specifically so we can harvest and use its leaves as an herb.
Right.
But sesame is grown specifically so we can harvest and use its seeds as a spice. We are essentially building a pantry outside.
Yes, a living pantry.
But how does a garden actually balance the metabolic demands of growing a plant for its extremities, like the basil leaves, versus growing a plant for its reproductive core, like the sesame seeds?
It is entirely about where the plant drives its nutrients. Basil is cultivated for vegetative growth. We constantly pinch off the flowers.
To keep it from bolting.
Exactly, to
Yeah.
force the plant to keep pumping its energy into producing those tender, highly aromatic leaves. The real value of basil is in its volatile oils, which are fragile and designed to evaporate quickly to attract pollinators or deter pests.
So basil is essentially a factory for fresh, aromatic extremities.
Precisely. Now, sesame, on the other hand, is a factory for dense caloric energy.
Where the seeds.
Yeah. Once the sesame plant reaches maturity, it just stops worrying about its leaves. It channels all of its water, all of its absorbed sunlight, and all of its soil nutrients straight into developing the embryo inside the seed.
Wow.
It packs those tiny seeds with heavy, stable oils and proteins that are meant to sustain the next generation.
So you have the basil providing the fresh, volatile, leafy component of your kitchen, and the sesame providing the dense, oil-rich, reproductive core.
Yes.
It is a complete culinary spectrum growing right next to each other in the dirt.
And the intentionality behind curating that balanced ecosystem is exactly what makes this approach so powerful.
Totally.
Both of these plants are affordable, they're readily available, they serve entirely different culinary purposes. One is fresh and leafy, the other is dry and nutty.
Right.
Yet they come together to create a deeply practical garden. And you sourced half of that ecosystem straight from the grocery aisle, completely bypassing the traditional gardening industry.
It is subversive, really. It makes you look at your kitchen cabinets in your backyard simultaneously, and you realize that the barrier between the two is just, well, it's completely artificial.
It really is. The grocery store is not just the end of the line for food. It can actually be the absolute beginning.
It closes the loop.
Yeah.
You are no longer entirely dependent on specialized vendors to dictate what you can grow, or to tell you that gardening must be this expensive, anxiety-inducing hobby.
Exactly. You literally hold the raw materials for an entire ecosystem in your hands every single time you cook.
It's amazing. So, to bring all of this together for you, the defining insight from this deep dive is that a vibrant, fascinating garden does not require expensive, highly curated seed catalogs.
Nope, not at all.
A simple, cheap jar of sesame seeds from the spice aisle possesses a remarkably high germination rate, simply because its processing leaves its protective oils and dormant embryo completely intact.
And by understanding the mechanics of that dormancy, you gain access to thousands of viable seeds for just a few dollars.
Right.
Which completely eliminates the fear of failure that usually stops people from gardening in the first place.
You get these incredible, unique plants with, microscopic hairy radiators, quilted solar panel leaves, and soft, thick stems designed to rapidly produce a massive caloric yield.
It's quite the resume for a plant.
It really is. A plant that perfectly balances the leafy herbs you might already have, giving you a functional garden of both seeds and leaves. It is cheap, it is accessible, and it completely demystifies the act of growing things.
It is a really powerful reminder that nature is incredibly resilient. It is often just waiting in a state of suspended animation for us to give it a chance, even if it happens to be waiting inside a plastic shaker jar.
Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to chew on as we wrap up today.
Yeah. If a cheap, everyday grocery store spice like sesame can effortlessly transform into a vibrant, highly textured plant right in your backyard, what other standard items, sitting completely ignored on your pantry shelves, are secretly hiding an entire dormant ecosystem, just waiting for a little bit of soil?
Think about the mechanics of survival the next time you walk down the grocery store aisle. It is not just a pantry. It is a vault of untapped biological potential.